So you have to create your dress code for your school? Well, knowing and understanding the law is very important. You might not have realized that the law really has a lot to do with the dress code. If you're looking at the First Amendment, it discusses your right to free expression, your right to speech. The way a person dresses can be seen as they're exercising their right to free expression. Many people believe that the state courts should address the issue of dress codes within schools, but so far the U.S. Supreme Court has stayed relatively silent on the issue. So, why is it such a controversial topic? I think the main reason it's a controversial topic is that the clothes a person wears, or how they do their hair, is a reflection of their personality, a reflection of who they are and what they believe, the values that they support, and their background and culture. So, how can schools regulate what students wear and yet allow students to maintain their own self-expression? That's the true question. One thing you need to remember is that when creating dress code standards, one must make sure that the rules are not vague, they're not ambiguous, and they're not unreasonable. You need to give a reason for how the dress code would cause a disruption to the education process. The rules should be clear, concise, and reasonable. Some things to consider. The first is some safety issues. You need rules that protect the student's safety, and those are acceptable rules. Rules such as wear a hairnet in a home economics class, or no long jewelry or hair in science labs. You don't want to cause any kind of danger to the students. Also, there's health issues. Rules that protect the well-being of students. For example, students should wash their hair regularly, or hair can only be a certain length to avoid the spread of parasites or fungi. Clothing that might cause a disruption to the flow of the classroom is unacceptable, and you can make that a rule. There's also the community standard issues. If the dress goes against the community standards, then regulations concerning the standards are appropriate and acceptable. For example, a slogan that might go contrary to the school's mission statement can be restricted. Or an article of clothing that depicts offensive language. It could be actual words or pictures. It could be vulgarity, immodesty. Also, clothing that may offend a particular group of people based on their race, their gender, their color, their sexual orientation, their religion, their language, or their national origin are all examples of clothes that can be restricted. Also, clothing that is immodest may be prohibited. Courts are very divided on the community standard issue. On the one hand, you have the case of Morse versus Frederick. In this case, a student had made a banner that was depicting support of a prohibited and illegal substance. Since it was a violation of the school's policy and of state law, the student was disciplined. In this case, the U.S. Supreme Court agreed with the discipline of the student and upheld the school's decision to discipline the student. On the other hand is the case of Giles versus Marino. In this case, a student had worn a shirt that depicted President Bush as a chicken. He had a martini in one hand and a coconut straw in the other. Though the type of self-expression might be seen as harsh by some, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals disapproved of the discipline of the student. It ruled that it violated that student's freedom of speech. So when creating dress codes, you really have a lot of things to think about. First thing you need to do is really review the policies of the Board of Education and your school district. Are your policies or your rules in line with the policies of the board? Also, it's important to ask for input from a variety of members. You want to ask teachers, parents, faculty, and other citizens of the local community. And finally, you really should ask yourself questions to make sure the regulations are acceptable. Some common questions that you should ask yourself. Are these rules contrary to my style and fashion? Or are they contrary to the policies of the school? If you're making the rules because the clothing is contrary to your style and your fashion, then the rule is not acceptable. But if it is contrary to the policies of the school, then it's an acceptable rule. Another question you might want to ask yourself is there a reasonable, defensible explanation for prohibiting certain articles of clothing? For instance, does the rule prohibit vulgarity? Does it prohibit biased attitudes? Does the rule prohibit clothing that does not conform to the community's standard of decency? These are all questions that are important to ask yourself. You really must make sure that your rules are not biased in it. I created this presentation using Chapter 4 of A Teacher's Pocket Guide to School Law, the second edition by Nathan L. Essex. When considering dress code, this book would be very helpful in creating dress code that abides by the laws.